As you'll remember, measurement and assessment were key challenges that we identified through the application process. As we all know, and as Trish also stated, there's no shortage of new ideas on audience engagement strategies. Measurement is difficult enough given the complex factors that drive attendance and impact. Even a question as simple as how do we measure success is tricky because we have to define success before you can actually measure it. And theaters can't define success solely by the hard numbers of ticket sales, but by something more intangible. As Zelda Fitzhandler so perfectly put it, once we made the choice to produce our plays, not to recoup an investment, but to recoup some corner of the universe for our understanding and enlargement, we entered the same world as the university, the museum, the church, and became, like them, an instrument of civilization. So, how do we measure that? I'm pleased to bring to the stage two speakers who have been wrestling with the same very issues in their own ways. Brad Erickson, who is the Executive Director of Theater Bay Area, which recently published Beans, just kidding, Counting New Beans, Intrinsic Impact and the Value of Art. And Tom Kaiden, who is the President of the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, and you all have been such a great partner for this convening, so thank you. Tom is also the Chief Architect of Engage 2020, a marketing and civic engagement initiative focused on doubling cultural participation in Greater Philadelphia by 2020. And of course, our own Teresa Eyring will be our moderator. So please join me in welcoming Brad, Tom, and Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you. So gentlemanly. Hi, everybody. We're excited about this session because, indeed, as Defina mentioned, the idea of measurement and assessment came up again and again in the challenges that you all articulated to us before the convening. And I know that we've had so many fantastic ideas and strategies that have been shared over the last few days. So the question becomes, how do we think about measuring the strategies that we're implementing in order to decide, as Trish Santini's number 7 went, whether or not to keep really investing in things or maybe let certain things go. So the other thing is that just listening to all of our plenary speakers, from gamification to hospitality to our Blue Star States presentation today, the idea of measurable results just kept coming up again and again. And I think for so many organizations, measurement is either the really onerous thing that you have to do because a government agency or a funder requires you to, but you're not sure exactly what that tool is ultimately or the results are going to do to help you make decisions about the future of that program, or you don't feel that you have the resources necessarily to design a measurement strategy and then really implement it effectively over time. So we want to try to get at here, the way we're going to structure this session is really to talk about the why, the how, and the what. Why measure? How do you do it? How do you decide what to measure? And then what do you do once you get the results of your measurement tools? I wanted to also get to know these guys a little bit. I mean, I do know them, but Tom and Brad are each the heads of agencies that really serve their cultural communities for major cities, Philadelphia and San Francisco. They are fantastic leaders in our field, really known nationally, and I know for TCG we really benefit from their wisdom and knowledge and leadership on a daily basis. I'm just curious, don't tell me about your community. What do you envy or respect or love about Brad's community?
So if I wasn't in Philly, I'd be in San Francisco. But we were joking earlier about the food. The thing that, you've been in Philly for a couple days now. I have to say, I am so proud of so much here, but our native food products, the pretzel, the cheesesteak, the tasty cake, I gotta confess, as a non-native Philadelphian, that's not it. So my favorite thing, San Francisco, to be in the center of Ghirardelli chocolate, Napa wine. Not a bad place to be in City by the Bay. So.
Yeah.
What do you say about Philly? Tell us what
do I envy about Philly? Well, it's really amazing to be. We've got Independence Hall is across the street. Did anyone happen to notice this? There's amazing history. The Liberty Bell is right around the corner here, and while actually San Francisco's over 200 years old as well, it doesn't really rival the kind of place in American history that this city has, and so I envy that.
Okay.
And I should also say, I said San Francisco, but I realized that you represent
whole
the
of the
Bay. Okay. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that one of the difficulties with measuring is just that we deal with the fact that we have often qualitative things that we're trying to measure, and in other cases, the measurement is quantitative. And I was always inspired by a quote from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great for the Social Sectors. Do you all know that book? Yeah, I really learned a lot from reading that piece. And he said, it doesn't really matter if you quantify results. What matters is that you rigorously assemble evidence, quantitative or qualitative, to track your progress. If the evidence is primarily qualitative, then think like a trial lawyer assembling a combined body of evidence. If the evidence is primarily quantitative, then think of yourself as a lab scientist or perhaps a chemist assembling and assessing data. So I love that, assemble evidence like you're a trial lawyer, because again, so much of what we're trying to assess when it comes to the strategies we've been talking about it's really qualitative and not quantitative. So I guess I just want to kick it off with you by asking, why did each of you, when you think about measuring, you each have very important tools that you're going to walk through with us. But why did you decide, or why did you decide to measure what you measured?
So I can talk about, the thing I'm going to talk about today is something called the Cultural Engagement Index, which we started about 4 or 5 years ago. And I can tell you the reason we did it was to push ourselves. And I think we'll all talk about I think there's no one right measure, and you're sort of always looking for different elements. But I think you have to go, at least for us, to go back to what is it we're trying to accomplish. And I will tell you the origin of the Cultural Engagement Index that I'm going to show you later is we had just launched 3 new marketing programs, a regional events calendar, a ticketing service, and a list cooperative, and we felt very good about them. But as we ended the end of this grant period, we looked around and there were still empty seats in town. And so one of the things we sort of said is, one of our challenges is we're always sort of operating within this 3-year time horizon. That's our grant cycle. But if we're really making good decisions, if we want us to do the best that we can, what if we opened up the time cycle? What if we sort of said, what if we did everything right over the next dozen years? What would the world look like in 2020 if we did everything right? And that was how we came to this goal of doubling engagement. And what I loved about that piece is it sort of forced us out of the moment where you sort of have your hands on the fine-tuning knob and you're actually changing the channel. And that's what we were trying to do, was to essentially push ourselves to change the channel, to look for the big areas of lift. And the Cultural Engagement Index sort of let us get there.
Great. And Brad, your intrinsic impact study, why did you decide to do that study? What was it that you were looking for?
Well, so here's the real reason, or like the motive, the thing that really started me thinking about this in the very first place was, within the first month of my coming out of the job at Theater Bay Area about 10 years ago, I was at an arts marketing conference in Sacramento. And while we were having our lunch, it was not as good as the lunches we were having the last couple of days, someone came running into the room, and there must have been a couple hundred of us, just like today. Someone came running into the room and said that across the street, meaning that in the Capitol building, they were voting right then to eliminate the California Arts Council. And the California Arts Council's budget had been a couple years before at $30 million. It had been reduced to $20 million. We were fighting really hard to make sure that it wouldn't get more than a $5 million cut. It was, hard times. We go through boom and bust a lot in California. But now we were talking about eliminating it entirely. And the room, to a body, rose up, ran across the street, and started just really literally running through the halls and screaming and yelling at legislators. I'm not kidding. And I grabbed a board member, Amy Mueller, from the Playwrights Foundation. I said, we're going to go talk civilly with our legislators, and we didn't know at all. And it occurred to me that, A, this is not how you build relationships with lawmakers. And that we didn't really have a very good way of articulating our value. So the question behind intrinsic impact was really about, in the face of what became a 97% cut to the California Arts Council, they didn't eliminate it, they left $1 million on the table. $1 million for 38 million people. Okay, so we've been in last place in arts funding in the whole country for the last 10 years, until last year, when Governor Brown back in Kansas did us a favor and eliminated their arts council, boosting us all the way up to 49th. So 3 cents per person is still more than 0, which is what Kansas is spending. So we spend 3 cents, they spend 0. that was the reason. How do we talk about the value of art? And that's really where the question came from, because it seemed like it wasn't enough to just talk about the things that we had normally been talking about. And I'll go into that more when I get into the presentation, but that was the question.
Okay, great. So I want to ask Tom if you would talk to us about what you did actually. What was your survey? What did it look like? What did you discover?
Sure.
And if, yeah.
So the origin of the Cultural Engagement Index was actually my reading a book by Tepper and Ivy called Engaging Art, and I suspect many of you have read it. If you haven't, I'd certainly urge you to do so. It's a great anthology of different articles. But the thing that really emerged from that piece was that the nature of cultural participation was changing, and that where we had been so focused on butts and seats, and sort of lamenting what was being tracked in the survey of public participation in the arts, which was sort of declining traditional participation, that in fact citizens didn't think that they were less culturally engaged. They were just engaged through their own participation. And it occurred to me that our measures were tracking only a portion of what was going on. And we wanted to be able to, A, understand the full nature of engagement so we could measure its change over time. Because if you want to take a 12-year time horizon, you want to be able to watch what's happening over the course of 12 years. So that was sort of one thing that we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to encompass personal practice and understand the sort of pro-am movement and be able to track it. But we also wanted to be able to come up with a measure that would be respected, not just within our sector, but outside. So we created something called the CEI, Cultural Engagement Index, kind of like the CPI tracks inflation. We wanted to track cultural progress and be able to report on it. So it gave us essentially an internal measure to drive us to have conversations within the field as a management tool, but it also gave us a credible sort of external communication piece. Mm-hmm. And I would just say the other thing that I wrestled with a little bit was sort of a marketing 101 challenge, which was I'd been taught in sort of marketing 101 that there's sort of the 4 Ps of marketing, right? It's product, price, place, promotion. And as a service organization, I felt like we never got to touch product, which in this field feels like the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And there was this sort of constant stress between the marketing folks and the artistic folks. Right? The artistic folks would sort of determine what it was we were going to perform or create or whatever, and then run down the hall and tell the marketing folks, go sell tickets to this. So we were looking for a tool that would essentially get those folks in the room together talking about research so that there was a shared discussion about what do we want the experience to be so that we can grow engagement in all its senses. So we're trying to do a couple things. We're trying to get the organization to focus on product collectively. We're trying to establish a measure so we can track progress over time, which is sort of longitudinal measurement. We're trying to gain respect outside of our sector, which hopefully leads to more philanthropy and more corporate giving. So all those things are sort of playing at once, and also, again, trying to track the emergence of the pro-am movement.
And you have some illustrations of what you did, correct?
Yes, and we're going to do that.
Okay. Brad, maybe you can talk also about sort of a little bit more detail about what your study looked like.
Yeah, so interestingly, the idea behind the study also came from a book. This came from Gifts of the Muse, and this is, okay, I'm now going to out myself as being like the biggest nerd ever. I'm in Palm Springs on my 45th birthday by myself after a big breakup of 15 years, right? I'm there by myself. I'm by the pool, and I'm reading Gifts of the Muse. Pathetic. So I'm reading through it, and it's making this really strong argument that the things that advocates in the arts have been talking about for the last maybe 15 years or even 20 years or so have been the extrinsic, the secondary value of the arts. And we talk about it a lot, and they're real. You know, when you have a show, the restaurant and the bar next door has more business. You know it, you see it, right? We know that the arts enliven downtowns. Richard Florida has talked about the way that the arts are kind of a magnet for other creative people. We know that the arts increase tolerance in young people, that kids who study music do better in math and kids who study theater do better in English. Yay! None of that is why we do art. None of that is why anyone really goes to the arts. It's secondary. The primary thing is that, what is it? It's that deeply felt personal response to the art. That is the most important. That is the intrinsic impact. And Gifts of the Muse was saying, that's the deepest value of art. That's what we should be talking about. So I had the book in my hand, and I slam it down on the pool, and I go, yes! And everyone's looking at me, and I'm like, oh. And then it said we should be talking about captivation and delight. And my mind went back to Sacramento, and I thought, how do I go to the legislature and talk about captivation and delight with a straight face? So the idea was there a way that you could count and measure in the same way that we count the dollars that are coming into the bar next door and the way that we see the math scores go up in the kids who are studying music? Was there a way that we could measure intrinsic impact? And lo and behold, Alan Brown found that there is a way that you can do that.
So that's great. Can you show us, starting with Tom, would you mind showing us some of the, I think you're showing us results or the study itself that you...
Yeah, I think we're going to take you through a couple slides that sort of show you some of the ways this played out. And if you actually, if you want to know more about it, the full report is on our website, and it's a subset of something we called Research into Action, which was actually 5 consumer research studies we did at the same time, and we actually digested all of them into a report where we actually didn't report on any of the individual studies. We actually just talked about 10 super trends or 10 mega trends that were coming out of the research, and then we put all the research studies up on the website for folks who are, you know, at their 45th birthday.
Super nerds.
Super nerds, super geeks. So
Awesome.
Brad would eat this stuff up. But anyway, so here, very quickly, the objectives were, 1, to stimulate innovation. We wanted to be able to track engagement over time. We wanted to inform cultural policy and reinforce culture as a recognized value. So those are the things we've already talked about. So here are the 9 components of the CEI. And I mentioned we were trying to capture both personal practice and sort of traditional forms of attendance-based behavior. So we wanted to talk about the way people were learning the arts and their skills acquisition. So think of this as sort of taking classes. We wanted inventive engagement, so people who were writing or creating. Interpreting was essentially the way they were interpreting other people's work. And curatorial engagement were the ways they were arranging art. So it could be, curation could even be curating tunes on their iPhone, right? So just different ways of curating. It could be the way they're arranging art in their home. For audience-based behavior, these were the sort of the more traditional measures, tracking performing arts attendance, museum attendance, history and science museums, participation in community cultural events, and then media-based consumption, which was through electronic media. So the ones on the right are the ones that everyone expected. It's the ones on the left that were sort of the new elements. And then we had to decide on weights of those things. And we actually ended up weighting personal practice at 40% and audience-based at 60%, which was completely arbitrary. And several people would say, so how did you decide that these are the weights should be? I think we sort of fessed up at the beginning. We don't know, but we're going to take a shot at this because we want to encompass these things, and we want to begin to be able to track both sides of the equation. So this is an example of sort of the way we measured within the survey. So this is one piece that's pulled out. And what I want you to really look at here are the traditional way you measure attendance is in terms of frequency. And when we looked at frequency, we used units of time that we thought weren't necessarily our units of time, but the way people who are filling out the form think about it, right? So we wanted to sort of be kind to people. So we tend to think of things, like if you look at your planner, you look at, is it day at a glance, it's week at a glance, it's month at a glance. Those were the units of time we wanted to measure. And the second thing that we threw in there was a factor for what we called salience or importance, because we wanted to be able to understand how important these events were to people. Traditionally, we only look at how frequently you go. And I've used this illustration with other folks to describe, I brush my teeth twice a day, which means that in the course of a year, I have 730 experiences brushing my teeth. I go to Europe on vacation once every 5 years. I care a lot more about the trip to Europe than I do about brushing my teeth. But if we only use measures of frequency, we're not really getting the full story. So we wanted to measure importance as well. So very quickly, here are a couple of the results that we found. And some of them were surprising. The first was we had assumed that folks drop out of the cultural system when they have kids. In fact, our engagement scores showed that they actually increase their engagement when there's presence of kids in the household. And again, the orange bars here reflect personal practice. The blue are the audience-based portion of the activity. The nature of that was that, again, the folks Without kids in their homes, we're sort of had sort of more social objectives in terms of their participation. The folks with kids were sort of more focused on learning and nurturing of their children. We took a look at engagement by race. And one of the things that we found was that both Latino and African American participants had higher engagement scores than our white respondents. And again, that was an important finding, particularly in a city of color. So, I think it's increasingly as we look at demographic research, we know that the country is becoming more diverse. Here in Philadelphia, we know that our population will grow by about 500,000 people in the course between 2000 and 2020. All of that growth is going to come from people of color. So this engagement finding was actually really encouraging, an important piece of information for people to know. We looked at the influence of cultural role models, and we found, not surprisingly, that the presence of a role model from your family increased engagement, from someone outside your family increased engagement, and if you had both, you were twice as likely to participate as if you had no cultural role models. So all that work that we do, sort of encouraging folks to talk to their friends, turns out is reinforced by this. Also, as an advocacy organization, we wanted to talk about culture being an influence on civic engagement. So we looked at 5 civic engagement measures, and we took a look at sort of what the overall engagement levels were of the folks who were responding. And then we tracked that engagement against cultural participation. And not surprisingly, the more ways that you were civically engaged led to greater cultural engagement, was totally correlated with civic engagement. And it just goes up in a linear fashion. Finally, the thing that we talked about was personal practice. And I pulled up the slide that has to do with theater, but believe me, this played out in every single other industry we looked at, or every other discipline we looked at within culture, which was there was a strong linkage between personal practice and attendance at the event. So it didn't matter whether we were looking at museums, theater, singing. If you do it, you're more likely to attend. So for our folks, for some of our members who said, why should we bother to track personal practice when we can't sell a ticket to personal practice? We said personal practice, 1, it's the right thing to do. 2, it's what they're doing anyway. But 3, it turns out it actually does impact ticket sales. So here are some summary observations that came out of it. First, investments in culture are also investments in civic engagement. Understanding cultural engagement is more richly understood when we take a broader definition of culture. Personal practice is correlated with attendance-based activity. Communities of color in our region are vitally engaged. Engaging more adults with modest education levels was really linked to personal practice, and so as we were trying to think about an entry point for folks to the cultural sector, personal practice was really important for that. Presence of the children in the household does not diminish engagement, it actually increases engagement. Keeping older adults engaged in personal practice is a key challenge. That was one area where we saw amongst older folks, personal practice was lower, so that was an area for us to work on. And the importance of cultural role models, again. So those were the key findings that came out of that particular piece of research. So you sort of understand the trajectory that we took here. We're trying to push a little bit, trying to get outside the traditional product base and set this sort of lofty goal of doubling engagement, and this was the sort of path for us to get there.
Wow, fascinating. Can I just ask you, before we move on to hear about Brad's system, if you could just talk, you talked about the takeaways. How are you actually utilizing those takeaways now? I mean, what are you doing as the Cultural Alliance? What are the arts organizations in this community doing with that information?
Yeah, so this was part of a research into action strategy that we set. Basically, we said, as a service organization, we're really good at doing research, but it's not particularly meaningful unless people can actually activate it. So we wanted to do 2 things. We wanted to go through a sequence where we put research first, interpretation second, and then implementation and innovation third in that sort of sequence. So what we did was we digested these 5 research reports into a report I mentioned earlier called Research into Action. And then we actually did a series of innovation grants where we encouraged folks, 10 organizations in our region, to adopt at least one of the 10 trends that we saw. So we began to see so essentially we created an incentive for some follow through from the 10 trends that we identified. The other thing is that we're tracking the engagement measure over time. So this graph shows you essentially the 9 elements of cultural engagement that we mapped out originally. We did a second survey to sort of see if we're on track. To have been on track in 2010, we would have had to have an index, with the index, the baseline index was 100 in year 1. We needed to get to 112 by 2010. Then the recession came along, and so we expected the cultural engagement index not to hit its objectives, and we did in fact miss. We missed by 1. It was actually 111 at the first tension. So we're actually pretty encouraged by that. I think that we're sort of on track. We'll be doing this measure again next year, so we'll get sort of a second pass at sort of how we're tracking over time. But I think most importantly, it just encourages us to stretch. And as I said sort of at the beginning, take our hand off the fine-tuning knob and look to change the channel.
Great, thank you. Brad,
Good, yeah.
How do you measure intrinsic impact?
How do you measure intrinsic impact? Well, let me see if I can tell you. And I'm really delighted to say that a number of you and your organizations are involved in the study or have been involved in the study. So thank you for that. And for those of you who are not as familiar with the work that we've been doing, let me see if I can explain it a little bit. The slide that you see here, if you can describe something, you can measure it. Alan Brown loves to tell this story. It was a remark that was made to Alan when he observed at a meeting in New York with a bunch of very important funders and other leaders. After they all were reading Gifts of the Muse and remarking on it, then Alan observed, so you're saying that for many years you've been telling us about the importance of measurement and hard metrics when we're talking about the arts. And now you're saying that actually the most important thing is something that is internal and essentially unmeasurable. And this program officer wheeled around to Alan and said this: if you can describe something, you can measure it. So Alan kind of took that as a gauntlet that was, thrown onto the floor, and he was trying to figure out how in the world you could do that. I happened to run into him at a NAMP conference in Miami, probably about 9 months after I slammed the book on the pool side in Palm Springs, and was sort of cruising around through the breakout sessions. Had never really met Alan Brown before, I'd heard of him, of course. And there he was, and there was a bunch of charts and graphs on the wall, and I was coming in very late into the session, and I was only kind of trying to glean through what he was talking about, and I thought, you're what? You're measuring what? And what he was measuring that had been funded by the University Presenters Organization was intrinsic impact. So I sort of ran out the door and more or less tackled him and said, I really want to know more about that, and if we can work together in some way, I would love to make that happen. And I have to say, the Doris Duke Foundation has been so amazingly supportive of this. They funded the first pilot that we did actually in connection with Free Night of Theater a number of years ago, and then have come back several times along with other funders, including Pew and Mellon and the NEA and a host of other funders who helped us to really dive into this research, which was into intrinsic impact. And the first thing that we needed to do was to really understand it a little better. We talk about it being that deeply personal response. So what exactly do we mean by that? And we're really talking about the intellectual, social, emotional, and empathetic impact of a piece, of an art experience on the audience in ways that can be measured and talked about in a standard sort of way. That's the way that we're describing and defining intrinsic impact. So the research that we did was actually, it had a national scope. We worked with 18 theaters in 6 different metro areas around the country over the course of 11 months, following three productions, 3 plays in each one of these 6 theaters, from really big theaters that you know about, like the Public, the Arden here in Philadelphia, to some much smaller theaters around the country as well. We did, as I said, 18 theaters in 6 cities. It resulted in 60,000 surveys that were sent out. 19,000 of those surveys came back, written paper surveys that my staff literally had to input into a data bank to get the results that we were looking at. And it was an amazing 40% response rate, which really talks about the eagerness and the hunger that people have to talk to you about the experience that they're having with your show. Really, really encouraging. What we looked at and what Alan designed was a way to get at that deeply felt response. We broke it into 5 different sort of categories of response. The first being captivation. What is captivation? It's that I think many of us know what it means in terms of music. If you go into a symphony or you go into whatever your favorite kind of music is and you really just lose track of time, you're just totally enveloped in the music, that's what captivation is in a music experience. We know that with theater as well. You stop doing your laundry list in your mind. You're no longer thinking about your day tomorrow at work. You're utterly caught up with the story on stage. That's captivation. It's the most important piece. It's the thing that leads to everything else, including your emotional response, your intellectual stimulation in the show, social bridging and bonding. Social bridging is if you're of one group and you're seeing a different kind of group on stage, that's bridging. Social bonding is your peeps, right? Your peeps are on stage, that's you. You're feeling a bonding with sort of your people like you. And then aesthetic validation and aesthetic growth. Aesthetic growth is when you're learning something new. It's a new kind of art. You haven't seen this sort of thing before, a new playwright, a new way of doing it, a new way of creating theater. Aesthetic validation is something that we all do a lot of. Many, many of you have a Christmas Carol that you put on year after year, and guess what? Those same audiences come back year after year. They are validating their own aesthetic choice. They love it, and they love coming back and finding out that they love it again, year after year. That's aesthetic validation. It's really important. It's a really important motivator for why we involve ourselves in the arts. So each show, we would measure all of these things, number of questions, 30-something questions per show that we worked with each theater. Every production has its own individual kind of profile or footprint. And it could be described in this really complicated looking radar graph or something that looks like, a spider's web. And you'll see up there the different kinds of things that we studied: social bridging, captivation, your emotional response, different kinds of emotional response, your intellectual engagement, and the way that you were connected or not connected with the people on stage and the people around you. All of those points were things that we looked at in each and every production. What we're looking at right now is the aggregate of plays versus musicals in the study group. And some really interesting things come out, maybe that are not so surprising, but maybe that are. So people tend to be really captivated by musicals and really awed by the virtuosity of the performers. This makes some sense. People also have a greater sense of social bonding. They feel more connected with the people around them in a musical. And they're often more emotionally engaged as well. Plays, on the other hand, again, this might make some sense. They're more intellectually stimulating on the whole in the aggregate. There's more newness, there's more aesthetic growth that's happening. You might be seeing a new kind of theater when you're going to see a play. And there is a way that the way that those play experiences have that emotionally charged experience, which is somewhat different than when you're seeing a musical. So those are ways that you could look at every production, or you could look at different productions and overlap them. You could also look at the way that different audience members, different kinds of groups in the audience responded to the work. So what we're seeing here is the way that decision makers responded to the work versus the people who were brought along as a guest. And guess what? Decision makers have a higher impact on a whole, which makes some sense. They're the ones who learned about the play. They're the ones who read up on it. They're the ones who figured out how to buy the ticket online. They called the box office. They dragged their spouse or partner to the show. Maybe they didn't even know what show they were going to go see, but there they were. So on a whole, the decision maker has a higher impact than the person who's brought along. And we're going to find that this is important overall because there's some things behind that. We also found that single ticket buyers, on a whole, this is really interesting, have a higher impact than your subscribers per show. Really interesting. And there's some things that might be behind this too. They probably have done more homework as well. And if you think about it, your subscribers buy for the whole season. They might forget what the fourth show in your series is about, right? They just know it's the third Thursday, it's time for them to go to the theater. That single ticket buyer has researched that show, has made an effort to go to that particular show, and made a decision to go. This leads to one of the big takeaways that we found from this study, which is that anticipation about the show leads to higher impact. The greater your anticipation, the greater the impact. The more homework you've done before the show, the greater your impact. Another way of displaying what we've just seen in charts and graphs are these beautiful word clouds. This is a word cloud that came from one of the shows that we studied, which was Booty Candy at Woolly Mammoth Theater in Washington. Some of you have seen the show, like Rachel. You'll notice that there's some really, and so a word cloud is, people would, on their surveys, they would just put down words to describe their experience of the show. The bigger the word is, more often it showed up in these surveys. So look what showed up here. Happy and sad equaled. Interesting. Confused was another big one. Humor, amazed, and then there was discomfort, angry. This show is all over the map, which is exactly what the playwright and the theater wanted to have happen. And that's really the whole point of this study, is to be able to help the theater makers understand what is the response that you want to elicit in the audience. And were you successful in eliciting that response or not? And maybe the audience responded in a way that you didn't expect. Maybe maybe it was supposed to all be happy, but look, there was a lot of sad. But maybe that's okay, or maybe it's not. You, as an artistic team, decide that, but this can show you in a really graphic way how your audience is responding. And this sort of word cloud versus those charts can be used in different circumstances. Some of your funders may well be interested in seeing those really complicated charts. Your individual donors, probably not so much, but this might really move them. Your artistic team is really going to respond to this word cloud, and your marketing team might really respond to that chart. I'm making some really gross generalizations here. Your board members, some might love this, some will love the charts. Again, it's a different way of displaying the way that your audience actually responded to the work on stage. So, the whole point of this was to find some insights into what we could do to deepen the impact of the work. And again, there's a couple here. I'm not going to read through all of these. Again, one of the biggest things is anticipation. How can you make your audience members really excited about seeing the work, dripping with anticipation? One of the biggest things we learned was to give them a little bit of an overview of the plot. The more they know about the plot before they come in, the more impacted they will be. Not knowing anything, a tabula rasa is not a good place for them to start, it turns out. Homework is a good thing. Another thing is that the after show discussion is really crucial. Either the formal discussion that you do or an informal discussion, and the other piece that's so important is the program. They take the program home and they read it. They use it to spur their memories. So many of the theaters in the Bay Area were such recycling nerds. We just plead with people to please leave your program so we can recycle it and use it tomorrow night. No, tell them to go home and take it with them. That's how their memories are sparked, right? Spend a little more money on the printing, it's okay. So all of this is trying to lead to ways that our theater companies can be increasing the impact that they want to have on their audience, understanding it, measuring it, and going back to deepen the impact, to make it stickier, to make those audiences come back. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to the wonderful funders who made this possible.
All right.
Oh, and you can buy the book. There's the address, theaterbayarea.org/intrinsic impact. You can buy the book.
And can I just ask you,
Yeah.
we're going to open it to questions in a second, but what is the future of this particular work? And do you think that it could be adapted to assess specific projects or strategies? So not necessarily the response to a play, but perhaps the response to a particular program.
Oh, interesting. Well, so we're in a second phase of the study right now. So I talked that the first phase we had 18 theaters in 6 cities around the country. We have 30 theaters that we're working with right now in cities all around the country. Really exciting. That is coming to a close in a few months or so. And then we are right now working with Alan Brown to sort of chart out together the future of this work going forward. He's very excited about making a future for it. So are we. So. And we have now made it possible that you don't have to do all these surveys by paper. They can be done by email. I don't need so many people on my staff that are sitting there typing in data, nor does Alan. So it's definitely an ongoing and living sort of thing. And if you're interested in it, please write me. It's easy, brad@theaterbayarea.org. I can tell you way more about it. That's a really interesting question. I think that there's things that can be learned about, I mean, again, with this principle of that if you can describe it, you can measure it. So if we're trying to judge And in a simple way, right? I mean, a survey is fairly simple. We've all been doing surveys for a really long time. It was just designing the right survey to get at the question. So I think we could take that principle and turn it into, if you're trying to assess the impact of a project or a program that you've been doing, maybe that isn't a show, in that same, using those same principles of asking the participants to describe their response in a way that you can maybe rate on a 1 to 5 scale. That's what we did with this.
That's great. And what's so useful about what you both shared with us is, Tom, in your case, you have a study that really measures community engagement in an entire community. And I think we all care about that. You know, what is the impact that our theaters are having in their communities as a collective? And then what you've just shared with us, Brad, is how you really focus on a particular production or a piece of work and how that's impacting the audience and how that might affect decision-making for the organization going forward. Are there questions or comments? Comments are welcome too. If you have a or a measurement tool or a piece of research that you have that you think might be useful for others to know about, or if you've participated in either one of these studies, Amy Murphy, because you've done both, I imagine, and would like to share, we'd love to hear from you. We just have a few minutes.
Hi, Ilana Brownstein from Company One. First of all, I'm loving all of this, but I have a very logistical question. Could you please release this as an ebook? Please, pretty please, I'm begging you.
Yes, and we will do that. We're trying to bring down the mountain of books that is still stacked in my conference room. So over time, that mountain is being eroded away, and so the ebook day is coming nigh.
I love you if you give me an ebook.
And Tom, you said your study is on your website?
Yes.
Okay.
Philoculture.org.
Tom, Andy from Pig Iron Theater Company. Just a question. When it came down to you voicing that there was some concern over the personal practice ticket buying, is there a point in that where we become kind of comp happy in our industry, where it's, if I go see a friend's show, I'm more than happy to see if there's comps available instead of shelling out an industry ticket or something like that? Is that kind of viewed into it at all?
With this particular piece of research, we weren't looking at comps or the price that was paid for a particular ticket. So if you attended a show, you were tracked in attendance-based behavior. The personal practice piece that we were looking at was essentially, do you perform, do you write, what do you are you active, or do you sing in your church choir? We were looking for sort of all forms of personal engagement, and it was a pretty wide spectrum. But so if you got a comp, we counted you in attendance. If you paid for a ticket, you were still attendance.
And this is also true with, for instance, if you're a young person who plays an instrument, you play cello, you might be more inclined to attend the orchestra.
Yeah,
correct?
I mentioned the Tepper Ivy book at the start. There's I can't remember which one of them wrote it, but it's one of the articles that really struck me, which was this sort of story that in the 60s, the sort of sports community did such a great job of cultivating little leagues. And so we have this whole nation of people who grew up playing baseball. They're now sort of all my age. They don't play baseball anymore, but they happily go to a Phillies game, and they can still relate to the experience of catching a ball or hitting a ball because they did it when they were 8, right? Our challenge was that at the same time, we invested a lot in professional art making. And so we created a distance where if you haven't had that personal practice, and so the challenge for us now in an age where arts education is obviously sort of much challenged by funding, is that we don't have this sort of generation of folks who are growing up having had the experience and who can relate to it on such a deep level, which is why, arts education, the mentorship elements are so critical, and that was one thing. So I was, again, sort of struck by the research work that someone else did, which is the Tepper Ivy book, which was an assimilation of other people's writing, right, which led us to do something about the way we measured, which we hope our members are then internalizing in terms of the work that they do and the things that they put out, which will hopefully lead to greater engagement. So there are lots of us who are sort of have our hands in the pot, and I think we each need to sort of take our share of responsibility.
That's great, thank you. More questions?
Hi, Allison Delacruz from East West Players in Los Angeles. This is really awesome. I ditto everything. It's really great. Tom, my question for you is, in looking at the way that I really appreciate that you were able to break out according to racial and cultural kind of ideas, looking at Black and Latino audiences, and I'm just wondering, were Asian and Pacific Islander audiences not answering? Was that not part of the question? Native Americans as well? Because I feel like, East West Players were an Asian American theater company, but I know that in recent experiences, colleagues are coming to us about how to engage Asian audiences, and I just so for me, like as we think about re-evolutionizing who we're thinking about, it's not, the racial diversity in the United States is not just white, black, and Latino, you know? And I know that this is probably indicative of the data that you got, but knowing colleagues here in Philly who are also reaching out to the Asian American community, I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, no, you sort of echo one of the concerns that we had in doing the research. The reason we didn't report it up there was we didn't have enough units to be statistically reliable in reporting differences in engagement. We had respondents, we had Asian respondents, right? We had sort of multiple, but the problem is we needed enough units of measurement to be able to report differences, and there wasn't a confidence interval that was sufficient for us to report on it in the metadata. So the key for us sort of going forward is if we want to look at those essentially audiences where our population is underrepresented here, is we'll have to oversample for those audiences, and we were pretty rigorous about sampling and oversampling around Latino and African American, but we didn't oversample with Asian audiences, and it's something that we may have to pick up in the next round if we want to understand those differences.
And I would love to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
This is where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we've tried to sort of uncover that with some of our demographic research. So we were able to talk about it demographically in terms of the way the makeup of the community was changing, but it wasn't reflected in a way that we could report it in the engagement index.
And I love the idea of East-West players helping the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance. So let's make that happen.
Yeah.
I'm Rachel Grossman from Washington, D.C., from Dog and Pony, D.C. I drank the Intrinsic Impact Kool-Aid. When I was at Woolly Mammoth, we're part of the study. It was incredibly helpful working on the engagement staff on the connectivity side, and then processing as a staff and with board members about the findings of the study for us to really sort of like continually to reflect on the process of programming. Now, as an artistic leader of a company, it's really helping doing a modified version on Google Form. And Google didn't pay me to say that, but like on Google Form, so very easy to allow us to track what our assumptions are about how our work is going to interface with the audience and what the audience's reflection is.
Great.
Are we done? Is that
No,
what
we haven't.
I wanted to see if we could hear from, I see Ben Cameron's hand up, and I know Amy Murphy's hand was up, so.
Yeah.
Since I was put on the spot, Teresa, I did want to say we were thankfully part of both studies. Really grateful for that. And we've always done a lot with audience engagement, even before it was a term. But it drove us to do more, and it makes us think about everything we do because of those studies. And we had an 88% subscription renewal this year.
Wow.
So I drank the Kool-Aid too. So.
I just had a comment and a question. One was, as a precursor to Alan's work with you, 14 major university presenters self-funded a study around intrinsic impact, which you can find on our website at ddcf.org. Part of what's interesting about that is they were looking at specific productions, and one production in particular, which toured, was measured at two different universities. One university of which had marketed it as an intellectual experience that'll expand the way you think. The other university had marketed it as an emotional experience you'll feel deeply. And to your anticipation level, the satisfaction levels were grossly different because of the marketing emphasis placed on the exact same production. So as a complement to this work, that MUP study might be worth looking at.
Yeah.
My question for Tom is, knowing that you've started down this road, I'm just curious how often you're checking in and whether already you've encountered any sort of course corrections toward this goal of doubling participation by 2020, or is it just too early?
I said we have done sort of we did the second wave of research 2 years in and got sort of that read. We are, for sort of selfish and budgetary reasons, lengthening the intervals at which originally we thought, oh, we'll do this every 2 years. So we're actually sort of pushing this one out, essentially the next measure out to 2014. So we'll get sort of another read then. I'm sort of reminded with this of the work that we do of this expression that came from, it was actually Leo Burnett who started this ad agency. It was the first job I had, my first sort of job coming out of school, and he had this expression, and the corporate logo was this hand reaching for the stars. And I can still remember the logo, and this is like a long time later, and he basically said, if you reach for the stars, you may not always come up with one, but you won't necessarily come up with a handful of mud either. And so in sort of setting this goal of doubling engagement, I don't know if we're going to get there, but I like the fact that we're pushing and we're asking the questions to get there. And I think, and we asked ourselves a lot of those questions when we were going through this, like, oh, do we really want to set a goal that's sort of that high? Because what if we fail? And that's really a stretch. And it wasn't just us. I think it was also our funders who said, look, we're funding this. Do we sort of really want to report this? And to their credit, they were willing to take a chance with us on this. So I don't know if we're going to get there. We may or may not. But I can tell you, the engagement scores were good. Our attendance numbers have been good during the recession. So when we're lobbying in Harrisburg, I can basically say to legislators, our demand for our product is rising in a recession. There aren't many industries that can talk about demand growing. But by the way, income is falling because your support is declining. And we can't keep growing this unless you make some investment. Like we can't keep doing this. So Ben, I'm not sure. I don't know if we'll get there, but I like the stretch.
That's great. Reach for the stars. And also just what Amy had to say, I think one of the things that strikes me just about measuring consistently and measuring the right things is that the act of it can really help propel progress. So it's not just having the information and saying, oh, that's interesting, look at how many people said this or that, but it's also that being consistent over time helps you actually make the progress towards your goals. So thank you very much. We're at time, but I really appreciate what you had to say and brought to us.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.